The crystal champagne flute shattered against the Italian marble with a sound like breaking bones. Wine splashed across Marcus Chen's worn black shoes as Ambassador Henri Dubois' laughter echoed through the opulent ballroom of the Meridian Grand Hotel. The French delegation erupted in cruel amusement, their voices carrying across the room, filled with Manhattan's most powerful elite. "Regardez-le," the ambassador sneered in rapid French, his words dripping with contempt as he gestured toward the man kneeling among the glass shards. "Look at him. Another American peasant who thinks wiping tables makes him worthy of serving his betters." Marcus remained perfectly still, blood seeping from his fingertips where the glass had cut him. Around him, the charity gala continued, senators discussing foreign policy, tech moguls negotiating deals, socialites planning their next vacation to the Hamptons. None of them noticed the single father of two working his third job of the day, being humiliated by a man who represented an entire nation. But what Ambassador Dubois didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the peasant kneeling before them held a doctorate in international relations from the Sorbonne. What they couldn't see was that Marcus understood every poisonous word, every cultural nuance, every diplomatic slight being hurled at him in the language he had mastered during 5 years living in Paris. And what they were about to discover was that some silences aren't born from ignorance. They're born from strategy. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Meridian Grand Hotel towers 47 floors above Fifth Avenue, its Art Deco facade gleaming like a golden crown against the Manhattan skyline. Tonight, the building pulses with the energy of New York's social season, the annual International Children's Fund Gala, where billionaires write 7-figure checks and call it charity. In the Crystal Ballroom on the 32nd floor, 1,500 of the world's most influential people gather beneath hand-blown Venetian chandeliers. The guest list reads like a directory of global power: tech titans from Silicon Valley, oil executives from Texas, pharmaceutical heiresses from Switzerland, and tonight's guest of honor, the French diplomatic delegation led by Ambassador Henri Dubois, a man whose family has shaped European politics for 3 centuries. The ballroom itself resembles a palace from another era. Walls of cream-colored silk stretch toward 20-foot ceilings adorned with gold leaf moldings. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across tables draped in ivory linens, each centerpiece a sculpture of white orchids, flown in from Colombia that morning. The cost of tonight's flowers alone could feed a family for a year. At the head table, Ambassador Dubois holds court, 62 years old, with silver hair slicked back and a perfectly trimmed beard. He wears a midnight blue Brioni tuxedo that costs more than most people earn in 6 months. His chest displays the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration, while his wrist bears a vintage Patek Philippe that belonged to his grandfather. Beside him sits his wife, Isabelle, draped in Chanel and dripping with diamonds that catch the light like captured stars. Their son, Alexandre, 28 and recently appointed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, laughs too loudly at his father's jokes while checking his Hermès watch every few minutes. The French delegation commands the room's attention not through volume but through an invisible authority that makes other conversations pause when they speak. These are people accustomed to having their words shape nations, their decisions affect millions, their approval sought by kings and presidents alike. But if the ballroom represents power, the service corridors beneath it tell a different story entirely. 5 floors below, in the hotel's staff preparation area, Marcus Chen adjusts his black tie for the 3rd time. His hands shake slightly, not from nerves but from exhaustion. It's 11:30 p.m. and he's been awake for 19 hours. At 6 this morning, Marcus was grading papers for his online teaching job, correcting essays about global economics for students at Pace University. By 8, he was dropping his daughters off at school, Emma, age 9, and Sophie, age 6, kissing their foreheads and promising he'd be home before they fell asleep. A promise he's broken 17 times this month. From 9 to 3, Marcus worked his day job at the French consulate's cultural center, translating documents and organizing events for visiting dignitaries. His supervisor, Madame Rousseau, treats him like office furniture, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. She has no idea that the quiet translator arranging her meetings once published award-winning research on Franco-American diplomatic relations. After racing to pick up the girls from school, Marcus spent 3 hours helping with homework, preparing dinner, and listening to Emma practice violin while Sophie colored pictures of butterflies. At 7:30, their babysitter, Mrs. Rodriguez, arrived, and Marcus kissed his daughters goodbye again, his heart breaking a little more each time. Now, at nearly midnight, he stands in his 4th job of the week, catering server at Manhattan's most exclusive events. The irony isn't lost on him. During the day, he facilitates communication between French and American officials. At night, he serves French champagne to people who would never acknowledge his existence. Marcus catches his reflection in the staff mirror, 34 years old, but the lines around his dark eyes make him look 40. His black hair, once perfectly styled during his academic days, now shows premature gray at the temples. The tuxedo he wears belongs to the catering company, crisp and professional, but hanging slightly loose on his frame. He's lost 20 pounds since Sarah died, not from grief alone, but from the simple mathematics of survival. Groceries for 2 growing girls versus groceries for 3. Chen! The voice of Roberto Martinez, the catering manager, cuts through his reflection. You're on champagne service for the French delegation. Table 1. Don't screw this up. These people tip in thousands or not at all. Marcus nods, straightening his shoulders. He's served politicians before, tech moguls, oil executives, pharmaceutical heiresses. He's learned to become invisible, to smile politely when they ignore him, to say, yes, sir, and of course, madam, while his doctorate gathers dust on his bedroom wall. Tonight feels different, though he can't explain why. As Marcus enters the service elevator, his phone buzzes with a text from Emma. Daddy, Sophie had a nightmare. She wants you to call and sing the French song you taught us. Marcus closes his eyes. The French song, Frère Jacques, which he learned during his doctoral studies at the Sorbonne, the same language he once used to debate international policy with future ambassadors, now reduced to lullabies for his frightened daughter. He types back quickly, "Tell Sophie I'll call in 20 minutes. I love you both." The elevator doors open to reveal the crystal ballroom in full splendor. Marcus steps into a world that once was his, a world of international relations, diplomatic protocol, and global influence. But tonight, he enters not as Dr. Marcus Chen, the scholar who once advised senators on French policy, but as a server carrying champagne for people who see him as part of the furniture. At table 1, Ambassador Dubois gestures grandly while recounting a story about his recent meeting with the President of France. His audience, 3 Supreme Court justices, 2 senators, and the Secretary of State, hangs on every word. The ambassador's English is flawless, but carries that particular French inflection that Americans find either charming or insufferable, depending on their mood. The president told me, Dubois says, pausing for dramatic effect, that America's influence in Africa depends entirely on understanding French colonial history. But how can Americans understand such complexity when they barely comprehend their own past? Polite laughter ripples around the table. Marcus approaches with the champagne tray, his steps silent on the thick carpet. Ah, the ambassador notices him. More Dom Perignon. Excellent timing. Marcus begins pouring, starting with Madame Dubois. His movements are practiced, precise, the pour controlled to create exactly the right amount of foam, the bottle twisted slightly to prevent dripping. These are skills he learned not in catering training, but during diplomatic receptions in Paris, where he once stood on the other side of such interactions. As he moves around the table, the conversation continues in English. The senators discuss trade agreements. The justices debate international law. The Secretary of State mentions recent tensions over NATO funding. Standard diplomatic small talk, the kind Marcus once participated in rather than overheard. But then Ambassador Dubois' phone buzzes. He glances at the screen and his expression shifts, becoming more guarded. He leans toward his wife and switches to French, assuming, like most Americans do, that changing languages creates privacy in plain sight. C'est Laurent, he murmurs, referring to his chief of staff in Paris. The situation with the trade deal is worse than we thought. The Americans are being impossibly stubborn about agricultural tariffs. Marcus continues pouring, his face professionally neutral, but inside his pulse quickens. He knows this situation, has read about it in classified briefings during his day job at the Cultural Center. The agricultural tariff dispute could affect American farmers for decades. They simply don't understand European sensibility, Isabelle Dubois replies in French. Americans think diplomacy means shouting louder until they get what they want. Precisely, the ambassador agrees, still speaking French while Marcus fills the senator's glass. They lack the intellectual sophistication for nuanced negotiation. It's like trying to explain poetry to farmers. Marcus's hand tightens slightly on the champagne bottle. These aren't just idle insults. They're policy positions being discussed at the highest levels of international relations, and they're being shared in front of him because he's assumed to be invisible, uneducated, irrelevant. Alexandre Dubois, the ambassador's son, joins the conversation. Father, you should see the briefing papers the Americans submitted about African economic development. It's embarrassingly simplistic. They propose solutions that ignore centuries of cultural complexity. What do you expect? Henri Dubois shrugs. Americans are culturally incapable of understanding subtlety. They see the world in terms of profit margins and military force. Intellectual nuance is beyond them. Marcus reaches for the last glass, the ambassador's own. As he pours, his mind races. These aren't just personal opinions being expressed. These are the private views of France's chief diplomatic representative to the United Nations, the man who speaks for 67 million French citizens in international negotiations. And they're being shared because the people at this table assume the server doesn't understand, doesn't matter, doesn't exist as anything more than a mechanical function delivering alcohol. The conversation continues, growing more candid as the champagne flows. The Dubois family discusses American foreign policy with the casual dismissiveness usually reserved for critiquing a poorly made film. They mock American universities, American culture, American democracy itself. Marcus has heard such conversations before, in academic settings, diplomatic circles, international conferences, but always as a participant, never as an invisible observer. The difference is startling. When people think they're unheard, their true opinions emerge without diplomatic polish. The worst part, Isabelle Dubois says, gesturing with her champagne flute, is their complete inability to appreciate art, literature, philosophy. They mistake entertainment for culture and commerce for civilization. It's genetic, Alexandra adds with a laugh. Americans descended from Europe's rejects, criminals, religious fanatics, fortune hunters. What can you expect from such stock? Marcus finishes pouring and steps back, tray balanced perfectly in his hands. Every word has been absorbed, analyzed, contextualized. These aren't just insults, they're intelligence. Information about French diplomatic positions that could influence American foreign policy for years. But as he prepares to return to the service station, disaster strikes. Alexandre Dubois, gesturing enthusiastically while describing American intellectual poverty, knocks over his water glass. The crystal tumbler tips, rolls across the table and falls toward the floor. Instinctively, Marcus reaches out to catch it. His movement is quick, reflexive, the kind of split-second reaction that comes from years of diplomatic training where every gesture matters, where preventing even small disruptions is crucial to maintaining proper atmosphere. He catches the glass cleanly, preventing it from shattering on the marble floor. But in doing so, he steps slightly forward, bringing him fully into the conversation circle, just as Henri Dubois says in rapid, contemptuous French. Look at this imbecile. He doesn't even realize we've been discussing his country's diplomatic failures for 20 minutes, completely oblivious like a trained animal performing tricks for tips. The words hang in the air like poison gas. Marcus straightens slowly, still holding the rescued water glass. His dark eyes meet the ambassador's pale blue ones across 3 feet of space that suddenly feels like an ocean. Time stops. Around the table, the English conversation continues. Senators still discussing trade, justices still debating law. But in the bubble of French that surrounds the Dubois family, silence falls like a heavy curtain. Because something in Marcus's expression has shifted. Not anger, not hurt, but a kind of crystalline clarity that makes the ambassador's next words die in his throat. Henri Dubois stares at the server standing before him, and for the first time tonight, truly sees the man behind the uniform, the intelligence in those dark eyes, the perfect posture that speaks of education, not servitude, the controlled breathing of someone exercising enormous self-discipline. Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Marcus says quietly, his voice carrying the precise accent of the 16th arrondissement, where he lived during his doctoral studies. Your water, glass. The words are simple, polite, correct, but they land like grenades around the table. Perfect Parisian French. Not tourist French, not textbook French, but the cultured accent of someone who learned the language in the salons and universities of Paris itself. Alexandra's mouth falls open slightly. Isabelle's champagne flute freezes halfway to her lips. Henri Dubois goes completely pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The English conversation at the table stutters to a halt as the Americans sense something significant has just occurred, though they're not sure what. Marcus places the rescued water glass gently on the table, his movements unhurried, controlled. Then he steps back to his proper serving position, hands clasped behind his back, face professionally neutral. But the damage is done. 3 words in perfect French have just shattered an entire evening's worth of assumptions. And judging by the expression on Ambassador Henri Dubois' face, this is only the beginning. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Ambassador Henri Dubois stared at the server who had just responded in flawless French, his mind racing through implications that grew more disturbing with each passing second. Around the table, the American officials sensed the shift in atmosphere. Senator Patricia Walsh, a woman who had navigated Washington politics for 3 decades, studied the frozen expressions of the French delegation with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to reading diplomatic crises. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Henri forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Simply a minor, linguistic surprise. But Marcus had already stepped back, resuming his invisible servant's position as if nothing had happened. He moved to the next table, continuing his champagne service with the same professional efficiency. Yet something fundamental had changed. The ambassador could feel it in the way other servers glanced toward their colleague, in the subtle shift of energy that rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. 20 minutes earlier, while Marcus had been adjusting his tie in the basement staff area, Ambassador Henri Dubois was holding court in the Meridian's executive suite, preparing for the evening's performance. To Henri, tonight's gala wasn't charity, it was theater, a stage where France's cultural superiority could be displayed before America's political and business elite. The key to managing Americans, he told his aide, Christophe Bernard, while his valet adjusted his Legion of Honor decoration, is understanding their fundamental insecurity. They desperately want European approval, particularly French approval, but lack the cultural sophistication to earn it genuinely. Henri had built his diplomatic career on this philosophy. At the Quai d'Orsay, France's foreign ministry, he was known as the American Whisperer, the man who could manipulate U.S. officials by alternating between condescension and grudging acceptance. American politicians, starved for old-world validation, would agree to almost anything for a hint of French respect. Tonight, Henri continued, we'll discuss the trade negotiations. The Americans will be eager to please, as always. We'll extract concessions on agricultural tariffs by making them feel intellectually inferior, then throw them a few cultural compliments as rewards. It was a strategy that had worked for 15 years. Henri understood that Americans, despite their global power, still felt like cultural adolescents seeking approval from their European parents. He exploited this psychological weakness with surgical precision. But as he prepared for tonight's performance, Henri Dubois had no idea that his carefully constructed worldview was about to collide with a reality he couldn't control or manipulate. Present moment. Marcus completed his service at Table 3, tech executives discussing semiconductor patents, and returned to the service station. His hands remained steady as he refilled his champagne tray, but his mind churned with the implications of what had just occurred. For 3 years since Sarah's death from ovarian cancer, Marcus had existed in two worlds that never touched. During the day, he was Dr. Marcus Chen, cultural liaison at the French consulate, facilitating communication between diplomats who saw him as competent but unremarkable. At night, he was invisible, a server moving through Manhattan's elite circles, unnoticed and unheard. The separation had been necessary for survival. When Sarah died, leaving him with 2 young daughters and $340,000 in medical debt, Marcus's academic career became a luxury he couldn't afford. His position as assistant professor of international relations at Columbia had been eliminated due to budget cuts just 6 months after the funeral. His book on Franco-American diplomatic history, 3 years of research, remained unpublished when his academic publisher collapsed. With no savings and 2 children depending on him, Marcus had accepted the translation position at the French consulate. The salary was barely adequate, the work beneath his qualifications, but it provided health insurance and steady income. The night jobs, catering, tutoring, freelance translation, filled the gap between survival and slow financial drowning. He had convinced himself it was temporary, just until he could find another academic position, secure tenure somewhere, rebuild the life that cancer had demolished. But 3 years had passed, and the temporary had become permanent. The world of international relations, his world, now knew him only as a service provider, not a scholar. Tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, those 2 worlds had collided, and Ambassador Henri Dubois the man whose diplomatic communications Marcus translated during the day, had just revealed his true opinion of Americans in general, and Marcus in particular. The irony was suffocating. Every morning Marcus arrived at the French Cultural Center on Fifth Avenue, where he translated Henri's speeches, arranged his meetings, and facilitated his communications with American officials. Henri barely acknowledged his existence, a polite nod, an occasional bon travail when particularly pleased with Marcus's work. But Henri had never bothered to learn that his quiet translator held a doctorate from the Sorbonne, had never discovered that Marcus once published papers on the exact diplomatic tensions Henri navigated daily, had never realized that the man organizing his schedule understood French politics, European history, and international relations better than most of Henri's own staff. Why would he? Marcus was just another American employee, culturally limited and intellectually unremarkable. Except now Henri knew better. 1 hour later, the gala's main program had concluded. Speeches about children's welfare had been delivered, checks had been written, and the crowd was settling into the evening's social phase. Marcus continued serving, moving invisibly through conversations about mergers and acquisitions, political campaigns and vacation homes in the Hamptons. But he was increasingly aware of being watched. Ambassador Dubois had not approached him again, had not acknowledged their brief exchange. Yet Marcus could feel the ambassador's attention like a weight. Across the ballroom, Henri's pale blue eyes tracked Marcus's movements with the intensity of a predator studying unexpected prey. The scrutiny made other staff members nervous. Roberto Martinez, the catering manager, approached Marcus during a brief break between service rounds. "Chen, what the hell did you do to the French guy? He's been staring at you like you stole his wallet." "Nothing," Marcus replied honestly. "Just served champagne." "Well, whatever it was, fix it. These people can get servers fired with a phone call. Keep your head down and stay invisible." Stay invisible. The advice that had governed Marcus's life for 3 years. But tonight, invisibility had been shattered by 3 words of perfect French. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Henri Dubois sat at the head table, barely listening as his wife discussed her latest charitable endeavors with the Supreme Court justices. His mind was entirely focused on the server who had just demonstrated that everything Henri thought he knew about the evening, about Americans, about servants, about his own superiority, might be catastrophically wrong. "Christophe," he murmured to his aide, who leaned in attentively. "The server who brought champagne. Find out everything about him, immediately." Christophe Bernard, a career diplomat trained in information gathering, nodded and discreetly activated his phone. Within minutes, he was coordinating with hotel security, cross-referencing staff records, and initiating background checks. What he discovered in the following hour would fundamentally alter Henri Dubois' understanding of the evening. The server's name was Marcus Chen, age 34, employed by Elite Events, catering for 18 months, clean background check, exemplary performance reviews, no disciplinary actions. But that was just the surface. Deeper investigation revealed a more complex picture. Dr. Marcus Chen, former assistant professor of international relations at Columbia University, published author on Franco-American diplomatic history, doctoral graduate of the Sorbonne, specializing in European Union policy formation, and currently employed as cultural liaison at the French Consulate General of New York. Henri's blood turned to ice water. The man he had spent 20 minutes insulting in French, the imbecile he had mocked as culturally inferior, was not only educated, he was more qualified in Franco-American relations than most of Henri's own diplomatic staff. Worse, Marcus Chen worked for Henri. Every morning this man translated Henri's communications, arranged his meetings, facilitated his diplomatic correspondence. Henri had been inadvertently employing the same person he was now insulting as evening entertainment. The implications were staggering. If Marcus Chen understood French well enough to comprehend diplomatic insults, he certainly understood the classified communications he translated daily. Henri's private opinions about American officials, his negotiating strategies, his assessments of U.S. political weaknesses, all of it had been flowing through Marcus Chen's desk for months. "Mon Dieu," Henri whispered, his face pale. "What is it?" Isabelle asked, noticing her husband's distress. Henri couldn't explain. "How do you tell your wife that you've just discovered your evening's entertainment victim is actually your morning's professional colleague? That the genetic inferior you mocked for 20 minutes holds advanced degrees from France's most prestigious university? That everything you thought you knew about American intelligence and French superiority had just been revealed as dangerous delusion?" Across the ballroom, Marcus refilled his champagne tray at the service station, trying to process the evening's events. His phone buzzed with another text from Emma. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" "Sophie keeps asking about the French song." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. His daughters were awake past their bedtime, waiting for their father to return from serving the very people who considered them genetically inferior. The absurdity was overwhelming. He typed back, "Soon, sweetheart. Tell Sophie I'll sing Frère Jacques when I get home." "Excuse me." Marcus turned to find a well-dressed man in his 50s, silver-haired and immaculately groomed, standing beside the service station. The man's accent was faintly French, his manner polite but intense. "I am Christophe Bernard, aide to Ambassador Dubois. His Excellency would like to speak with you privately." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Is there a problem with the service?" "Not exactly," Christophe replied carefully. "Please, follow me." They walked through the ballroom toward a small private dining room adjacent to the main space. Marcus noticed other staff members watching nervously. Being summoned by foreign dignitaries was never good news for servers. The private dining room was elegantly appointed but intimate, designed for confidential conversations during large events. Ambassador Dubois stood beside the window overlooking Fifth Avenue, his back to the door. "Thank you, Christophe. Please ensure we are not disturbed." Christophe nodded and closed the door, leaving Marcus alone with the man who had spent the evening insulting his intelligence, culture, and national character. Henri turned slowly, his pale blue eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that felt almost physical. The diplomatic charm that had characterized his earlier conversation was completely absent, replaced by something raw and calculating. "Dr. Chen," Henri said quietly, the title landing like a small explosion in the quiet room. Marcus maintained his professional server's posture, hands clasped behind his back, expression neutral, shoulders straight. But inside, his mind raced. The ambassador knew. Somehow, in the past hour, Henri Dubois had discovered exactly who he was talking to. "Your Excellency," Marcus replied in English, his voice steady. Henri switched to French. "I believe we have a situation that requires discussion." Marcus responded in the same language, his accent still carrying the precise inflection of educated Parisians. "What kind of situation, sir?" "The kind where a French ambassador spends 20 minutes insulting an American diplomat in his native language, only to discover that the diplomat understood every word." The admission hung between them like a blade. Henri was acknowledging not just the evening's insults, but their broader implications. This wasn't simply embarrassing, it was potentially career-ending. "I am not a diplomat," Marcus corrected gently. "I am a cultural liaison." "Who holds a doctorate from the Sorbonne and formerly taught international relations at Columbia University." Henri's voice carried a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "Who translates my official correspondence every morning and facilitates my communications with American officials every afternoon?" Marcus said nothing, allowing the ambassador to process the full scope of his miscalculation. "How long have you understood?" Henri asked. "Every word, Your Excellency, from the beginning." Henri closed his eyes briefly, the color draining from his face. Merde. They stood in silence for nearly a minute, the weight of the evening's revelations settling between them like dense fog. Through the window, Marcus could see the lights of Manhattan stretching toward the Hudson River, the same view he had admired during his graduate studies when the future seemed unlimited and bright. Finally, Henri spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. "What do you intend to do with this information?" The question revealed everything about Henri Dubois' worldview. Even now, facing his own diplomatic disaster, he assumed Marcus would seek revenge, advantage, or personal gain. The possibility of simple professionalism apparently hadn't occurred to him. "Nothing," Marcus replied honestly. "I intend to finish serving champagne, go home to my daughters, and return to work tomorrow morning." Henri's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe you won't use tonight against me? That you won't report my observations to your superiors?" "Your observations were shared in what you believed was a private conversation. I have no intention of violating that privacy." The answer clearly surprised Henri. In his world of diplomatic maneuvering and political calculation, such straightforward professionalism was rare enough to seem suspicious. "Why?" he asked. "I insulted you personally, professionally, and nationally. You have every right to demand satisfaction." Marcus considered the question carefully. Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he planning revenge against the man who had called him an imbecile, mocked his country, and dismissed his intelligence? "Because," Marcus said slowly, "you revealed more about yourself than about me, and because anger is a luxury I cannot afford. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Christophe Bernard entered with a concerned expression. "Excellence, forgive the interruption, but Senator Walsh is asking about you. She seems concerned about your absence." Henri nodded, then looked back at Marcus. The ambassador's face had aged 10 years in the past hour, the confident arrogance replaced by something approaching vulnerability. "This conversation is not finished," Henri said in French. "As you wish, Your Excellency," Marcus replied, bowing slightly. But as Marcus returned to the ballroom to complete his service, both men understood that everything had changed. The careful boundaries that had separated their professional and personal worlds had been permanently shattered. Henri Dubois had spent the evening demonstrating French cultural superiority, only to discover that his demonstration's target was more qualified in French culture than most French citizens. And Marcus Chen had spent 3 years accepting invisibility as the price of survival, only to learn that some revelations cannot be contained once they escape into the world. The question now was not whether their professional relationship could continue, but whether either man could survive its transformation. Back in the ballroom, Marcus completed the evening service with mechanical precision, but his mind remained in that private dining room, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Around him, the gala wound toward its conclusion. Guests exchanged business cards and made plans for future meetings. The French delegation prepared for departure. As Marcus cleaned and packed the catering equipment, he noticed Ambassador Dubois watching him again. but the predatory intensity had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of respect, wariness, and what might have been the beginning of genuine curiosity. At 2:47 a.m., Marcus finally left the Meridian Grand Hotel. The streets of Manhattan were nearly empty, the city settling into its brief period of rest between the ending of one day's ambitions and the beginning of another's. He took the subway back to Queens, sitting in the nearly empty car, still wearing his server's tuxedo, his mind churning through the evening's events. In 6 hours, he would need to be at the French consulate, translating documents and arranging meetings for the same man who had called him an imbecile just hours earlier. The absurdity was overwhelming, but also strangely liberating. For 3 years, Marcus had lived in careful compartments, scholar during the day, servant at night, father always. Tonight, those compartments had collapsed into a single complex reality. He was no longer invisible. Whether that was salvation or disaster remained to be seen. When Marcus finally arrived home at 3:15 a.m., he found both daughters asleep in Emma's bed, still waiting for their father's return. Sophie clutched her stuffed elephant while Emma's homework lay scattered across the covers. Marcus kissed both girls gently, then sat beside them and softly sang Frère Jacques in the same French that had caused such chaos just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. The language that had revealed his intelligence to Ambassador Dubois was the same language he used to comfort his children. As he tucked the girls into their proper beds, Emma stirred slightly. "Daddy," she mumbled, "did you have a good night at work?" Marcus paused, considering how to answer. Had he had a good night? His carefully constructed invisibility had been shattered, his professional relationships complicated, his future rendered uncertain. But for the first time in 3 years, someone in power had been forced to see him as more than invisible furniture. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered, I think I did." And as he finally collapsed into bed at nearly 4 a.m., Marcus Chen realized that tomorrow would bring either the end of his careful survival strategy or the beginning of something entirely unexpected. The only certainty was that Ambassador Henri Dubois could never again pretend that the quiet translator arranging his meetings was just another intellectually limited American. The question was, what would Henri do with that knowledge? At 8:47 a.m. the next morning, Marcus Chen stood before the brass doors of the French Consulate General, coffee in hand, wondering if he still had a job. He had slept for 3 hours, his mind churning through scenarios ranging from immediate termination to awkward pretense that nothing had happened. The consulate building on Fifth Avenue was a monument to French elegance. Limestone facade, wrought iron balconies, and the tricolor flag snapping in the autumn breeze. For 18 months, Marcus had entered through these doors as an invisible functionary. Today, everything felt different. Madame Rousseau, the cultural director, greeted him with her usual brisk efficiency. "Bonjour, Marcus. Ambassador Dubois has requested an immediate meeting. Conference room 3. Marcus's stomach tightened. Here it was, the reckoning he had expected. Conference room 3 was the consulate's most formal space, used for high-level diplomatic meetings. Oil paintings of French presidents lined the walls, and a massive oak table dominated the center. Sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking Central Park. Ambassador Dubois sat at the head of the table, still wearing yesterday's exhaustion on his face. But his posture was different, less commanding, more contemplative. Beside him sat Christophe Bernard and, surprisingly, Marie-Claire Fontaine, the deputy cultural attaché from the Paris headquarters. "Dr. Chen," Henri said as Marcus entered, "please sit." The use of his doctoral title was deliberate, formal, a recognition that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Marcus sat across from the 3 diplomats, his expression carefully neutral. In his briefcase were the usual translations and correspondence that comprised his daily work, but something told him those would be irrelevant today. Marie-Claire, Henri began, has reviewed your file overnight, all of it. Marie-Claire Fontaine was a woman in her 50s, with sharp intelligence and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had navigated French bureaucracy for decades. She opened a thick folder and studied Marcus with undisguised curiosity. "Your doctoral dissertation," she said in accented English, "was titled Cultural Diplomacy in Post-War Franco-American Relations, Language as Policy Tool. Published research includes 3 papers on European Union expansion and American foreign policy adaptation." She paused, her gaze intense. "Professor Delacroix at the Sorbonne describes you as the most gifted student in his 40-year career. He was quite surprised to learn you were working as a translator." Marcus said nothing. The compliment felt surreal after 3 years of professional invisibility. Henri leaned forward, his voice careful. "Dr. Chen, I must ask directly, given last night's conversation, do you believe you can continue working with this consulate?" The question hung in the air. Marcus realized that Henri was offering him an exit, probably with a generous severance package and glowing recommendations, rather than risk the complications of their continued association. "That depends," Marcus replied slowly, "on what kind of work you're referring to." Marie-Claire and Christophe exchanged glances. Henri's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." Marcus took a breath, feeling as though he were about to step off a cliff. "For 18 months, I have translated your correspondence, arranged your meetings, and facilitated your communications. But I have never been consulted on policy, never asked for analysis, never invited to contribute my expertise to French diplomatic initiatives." He paused, measuring his words. "If you're asking whether I can continue being invisible, translating documents without context while pretending not to understand their implications, then no. After last night, that's no longer possible." Silence fell like a stone. Henri's face went through several expressions before settling on something approaching surprise. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength, "that France has been employing a Franco-American relations expert as a secretary, and that perhaps it's time to acknowledge what you're actually paying for." Marie-Claire suddenly smiled, a quick, sharp expression of recognition. "He's right, you know. We've been wasting him completely." Henri looked between his colleagues, clearly struggling with the fundamental shift in perception that Marcus's words demanded. 24 hours ago, Marcus Chen had been useful but unremarkable office furniture. Today, he was demanding recognition as a diplomatic professional. "Dr. Chen," Henri said carefully, "are you proposing a change in your employment status?" "I'm proposing that we stop pretending I'm unqualified for work I've been doing effectively for 18 months, without proper recognition or compensation." The boldness of the statement surprised even Marcus, but Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't let them make you small, Marcus. You're worth more than they've allowed you to believe." Christophe cleared his throat. "If I may, Excellence, Dr. Chen's analysis of the agricultural tariff negotiations has been invaluable. His translations include contextual notes that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both American and European positions." Henri's eyebrows rose. "You've been providing analysis?" "In the margins," Marcus admitted. "Clarifications of cultural references, explanations of political implications that don't translate directly. I assumed someone was reading them." "Someone was," Marie-Claire said dryly. "Me, in Paris. I've been wondering for months who was providing such insightful commentary on American political nuances." The revelation seemed to shift something fundamental in Henri's perception. He leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus as though seeing him for the first time. "Dr. Chen," Henri said slowly, "what would you say if I told you the French ministry is considering a new position, cultural and political liaison, focused specifically on improving Franco-American understanding at the academic and policy level?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "I would say that depends on whether you're serious about improving understanding or simply managing American political sensitivities." The answer was simultaneously diplomatic and challenging, exactly the kind of response Henri expected from qualified policy professionals. "Both," Henri admitted with something approaching a smile, "and I suspect you understand the difference better than most." Marie-Claire opened another folder. The position would require relocation to Paris for 18 months, then rotation between New York and Washington for policy implementation, salary commensurate with senior diplomatic officer status, full benefits, housing allowance, educational support for dependents. Marcus's world tilted. Everything he had lost when Sarah died, academic respect, financial security, professional purpose, was suddenly being offered back. But the implications were staggering. "My daughters," he said quietly, "they've lost their mother. I can't uproot them again." "The position includes full relocation support," Marie-Claire continued. "International school enrollment, language tutoring, cultural adaptation services. Many diplomatic families find the experience enriching for children." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. The opportunity was beyond anything he had dared imagine when he put on his server's uniform the night before. But then reality reasserted itself. "This is guilt," he said quietly. "You're offering me a promotion because you feel guilty about what you said last night." Henri's face flushed slightly, but he didn't deny the accusation. "Perhaps," Henri admitted, "but guilt and opportunity aren't mutually exclusive. The ministry has needed someone with your qualifications for months. Last night simply clarified that we already employed such a person." Marcus studied the three diplomats seated across from him. Marie-Claire's expression was eager, professional. Christophe looked hopeful. Henri appeared conflicted but genuine. "I need to think about this," Marcus said finally. "Of course," Henri replied. "But Dr. Chen—" "Marcus, I hope you'll consider that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the most uncomfortable revelations." That afternoon, Marcus sat in Prospect Park, watching Emma and Sophie play on the swings, while he processed the morning's extraordinary offer. The autumn air was crisp, leaves falling in golden spirals around the playground, where his daughters laughed with the unconscious joy that had sustained him through 3 years of struggle. Emma ran over, breathless from playing. "Daddy, why do you look sad?" "Not sad, sweetheart, just thinking." "About work?" Marcus nodded. "How do you explain to a 9-year-old that everything might be about to change again?" "Are we going to move?" Sophie asked, joining them with her characteristic directness. Marcus was startled. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you look the same way you did when we moved here after Mommy died," Emma said matter-of-factly, like something big is happening. The perceptiveness of children was sometimes overwhelming. Marcus pulled both girls close, breathing in the scent of their strawberry shampoo. "Maybe," he said honestly, "would that scare you?" Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "Would we still be together?" "Always." "Then it's okay," she decided. "Adventures are better when you're not alone." That evening, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, Marcus called his sister Jennifer in California. "Paris?" she said after he explained the situation. "Marcus, that's incredible. Sarah would be so proud." "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted. "Uproot the girls again, start over in a foreign country, work with people who—" He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Who what? Who recognized your worth and offered you the career you deserve? Who insulted me for 20 minutes because they assumed I was too stupid to understand them? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Marcus, I watched you rebuild your entire life after Sarah died. You worked 3 jobs while raising 2 children alone and somehow managed to keep your dignity intact. Don't let one ignorant diplomat's opinions define your future. After the call, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the formal offer letter Marie-Claire had provided. Senior cultural and political liaison, a salary that would finally allow him to stop working nights. Opportunities for Emma and Sophie that he could never provide alone. But also working closely with Henri Dubois, the man who considered Americans culturally inferior. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Dr. Chen, this is Henri Dubois. I realize this is highly irregular, but might I speak with you privately before you make your decision? There are things I should have said this morning. Marcus stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Tomorrow, 6 p.m., after my daughters are asleep. The next evening, Henri Dubois looked smaller somehow, standing in the modest lobby of Marcus's apartment building in Queens. Gone was the diplomatic grandeur, replaced by something more human and uncertain. Marcus led him upstairs to the small apartment where Emma and Sophie were safely asleep. Henri's eyes took in the cramped space, the wedding photo on the bookshelf, the children's artwork on the refrigerator, the doctoral diploma hanging beside a crayon drawing of a butterfly. Coffee? Marcus offered. Please. They sat at the small kitchen table where Marcus helped with homework every night, where he had written job applications that never received responses, where he had cried alone after putting his daughters to bed during those first terrible months after Sarah's death. Henri seemed to understand the significance of the space. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Marcus had ever heard it. I owe you an explanation. Henri began in English, then switched to French, and an apology that goes far beyond what happened 2 nights ago. Marcus waited, allowing the ambassador the space to continue. I have spent my career believing in French cultural superiority, Henri said slowly, not as diplomatic strategy, but as fundamental truth. I genuinely believed that Americans lacked the intellectual depth for sophisticated diplomacy. He paused, staring into his coffee cup. 2 nights ago, I discovered that the most sophisticated analysis of Franco-American relations I had encountered in months was being provided by the man I considered an intellectual inferior. Marcus said nothing, but his expression encouraged Henri to continue. Worse, I realized that I had been employing and ignoring expertise that my own government desperately needs. For 18 months, your insights have been improving our diplomatic effectiveness, and I never bothered to acknowledge the source. Henri looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. I was wrong about Americans, about cultural superiority, and most specifically about you, but my offer yesterday wasn't motivated by guilt alone. What was it motivated by? Marcus asked. Necessity. France needs people who understand both cultures intimately, not French people who study America and not Americans who study France, but people who live authentically in both worlds. Henri's voice gained conviction. You are precisely what modern diplomacy requires, and I was too arrogant to recognize it. The admission hung between them in the quiet kitchen. Outside, Queens continued its evening routine, families finishing dinner, children being called home, the ordinary life that Marcus had built from the ruins of his academic dreams. The position is real, Henri continued. Not charity, not guilt, but recognition of qualifications I should have acknowledged from the beginning. Marcus considered this, weighing sincerity against diplomatic manipulation. What changed? Really? Henri was quiet for a long moment. Do you have children, Dr. Chen? 2 daughters. You saw their pictures. I have none. My career consumed everything: marriage, family, personal relationships. I told myself it was sacrifice for France, but truthfully, it was easier than admitting I might be wrong about anything. Henri's voice grew softer. Watching you these past 2 days, seeing how you balance expertise with humility, how you maintain dignity while serving people who don't respect you, how you protect your principles while providing for your children, I realized that perhaps Americans understand something about character that I have missed. The confession felt genuine in a way that surprised Marcus. This wasn't diplomatic maneuvering, it was something approaching vulnerability. If I accept, Marcus said slowly, how do I know this respect will continue when the novelty wears off? How do I know you won't revert to seeing me as a useful but inferior American once the guilt fades? Henri nodded as though he had expected this question. You don't, but I can offer you something better than promises. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. Your official appointment would be as senior advisor for cultural relations, reporting directly to the deputy minister in Paris, not to me. You would have independent authority to develop programs, allocate resources, and implement policy. Marcus scanned the document, his academic training automatically analyzing the bureaucratic language. What Henri was describing wasn't a subordinate position, it was genuine policy authority. Why? Marcus asked. Because, Henri said simply, I finally understand that the future of Franco-American relations depends on people like you, people who can bridge cultures without losing their authenticity, and because I would rather work with you as an equal than continue pretending you're invisible. As Henri prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Dr. Chen, may I ask you something personal? Of course. Your daughters, how do you explain your work to them? How do you maintain dignity while accepting positions beneath your qualifications? Marcus considered the question carefully. I tell them that all honest work has dignity, but that doesn't mean we have to accept limitations others place on us. I tell them that sometimes you have to start where you are, but you never have to stay there. Henri nodded slowly. Your daughters are fortunate to have such wisdom. They're the reason I have any wisdom at all. After Henri left, Marcus sat at his kitchen table until nearly midnight, reading through the formal offer, imagining the life it might provide for Emma and Sophie. Paris, international schools, a father who came home for dinner instead of leaving for his second job. But also the risk of uprooting his daughters again, of trusting people who had spent months ignoring his expertise, of believing that genuine change was possible. At 12:30 a.m., he made his decision. 1 week later, the French consulate's main conference room buzzed with activity as Marcus presented his preliminary proposal for the new cultural relations program. Marie-Claire Fontaine had flown in from Paris specifically for the meeting, joined by Henri, Christophe, and several senior policy staff. The fundamental challenge, Marcus explained, clicking to his next slide, isn't translating language, it's translating context. Americans and French often use the same words to mean different things, leading to miscommunication that affects policy formation. He had spent the week developing a comprehensive framework for improving cross-cultural diplomatic communication, drawing on his academic research and his 18 months of observing diplomatic misunderstandings from both sides. For example, Marcus continued, when Americans discuss fairness in trade negotiations, they typically mean procedural equity, equal rules applied consistently. When French negotiators discuss fairness, they often mean proportional outcomes, results that account for historical and cultural differences. Marie-Claire nodded approvingly. This explains why our agricultural tariff discussions have been so frustrating. Exactly. Both sides think they're being reasonable and the other side is being obtuse. But they're actually discussing different concepts using identical vocabulary. Henri, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. How do we solve this? Cultural interpretation protocols, Marcus replied. Not just linguistic translation, but contextual translation. Help both sides understand not just what the other is saying, but what they mean by it. The presentation continued for an hour, covering everything from educational exchange programs to diplomatic training curricula. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for several moments. Finally, Marie-Claire spoke. Dr. Chen, this is exactly what the ministry has been seeking. When can you start? Marcus smiled, thinking of Emma and Sophie, who had spent the previous evening planning their Parisian adventure with characteristic 9-year-old enthusiasm. 2 weeks, he said. I need to arrange for my daughter's school transfers and say goodbye to New York properly. Henri stood and extended his hand. Dr. Chen, I want to say something publicly that I should have said 18 months ago. The room fell silent as Henri addressed his entire staff in both French and English. Marcus Chen is not just joining our team, he is completing it. For too long, we have operated with brilliant French perspective on American culture and inadequate American perspective on French intentions. Dr. Chen brings expertise that makes our mission possible rather than merely aspirational. Applause filled the room, but Marcus was most moved by Henri's final words. I am honored to work with him as a colleague rather than employ him as a subordinate. That evening, Marcus picked up Emma and Sophie from school personally. No more evening shifts, no more racing between jobs. They walked home together through Queens, stopping for ice cream to celebrate their new adventure. Daddy, Sophie asked, in Paris, will people be nice to you? Marcus considered the question carefully. Some will, some won't. But the difference is, now I know my own worth, and people who know their worth are harder to dismiss. Emma, ever practical, asked, will you still sing us French songs? Every night, Marcus promised. But now you'll understand what they really mean. As they reached home, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Henri. Dr. Chen, thank you for accepting our offer. But more than that, thank you for forcing me to become the diplomat I always claimed to be. Marcus looked at his daughters who were already planning which toys to pack for Paris, and realized that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of courage. 2 nights ago, he had been invisible. Tomorrow, he would be indispensable. The difference wasn't in what he knew. That had never changed. The difference was in who was finally willing to listen. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.